Welcome to another episode of Courageous Healing. I am your host and producer, Victor Escalante, and joining me in the studio today is Adele George, the star of the show. Adele, welcome to another episode.
Thanks, I'm happy to be here.
And as we told you, listeners, from our previous episode, this is a continuation. This is part 2. Of the Wheel of Violence that we started last week. If you missed the episode, if this is the first one that you're listening to, go back and listen to that, because this is a continuation where we complete the Wheel of Violence. So Adele, take us to the next slice of the wheel.
Yep, we discussed the first 4. This time we'll finish up with the last 4. So what we're doing is we're talking about the power and control wheel of abuse. And then we go from the violent wheel to the nonviolent wheel, obviously giving you the counteract and the opposite of each one. So the next one is one that is really, really, really tough. It's using children. It's making her feel guilty about the children, using the children to relay messages, using the children to harass her, threatening to take the children away. We know in many instances that, while I don't have any children, Victor and I both know many people who have, been in abusive situations that have children. And
I decided not to have children with my first wife, Adele, for this particular reason, is I knew that it would be a disaster if I ended up divorcing and having to raise a child or children on my own, because she was incapable of mothering.
Oh, same. And the thing is that a lot of times what happens is when we were talking about, on the other half of the wheel where we were talking about using blaming and minimizing, the manipulative side of an abuser can also basically work really hard to manipulate a judge, to the point that the woman would lose control of or lose custody of the children, even though she's done anything wrong. And while she's been trying to, claim abuse, and she's been trying to prove her points, sometimes in the process of this, the kids get caught up pretty bad in a pretty bad wrangle. And especially because he or she weaponizes the children and uses them against you rather than, letting you be a parent and trying to protect your children. So when abusers are like this, their children are property. They don't really mean anything. They don't want to do anything other than use the children to hurt you. So if they turn the children against you, or if they use the court system or child protective services to have the children removed from you, 9 out of 10 times they're doing that in order to just continue to abuse you. And that will continue to do that. And the biggest thing that the couple of reasons that this is a really big problem is, one, a lot of these women that are in abusive situations may not have jobs that will allow them to be able to afford legal representation. And then with that means that if they get legal representation, it'll be less than adequate. And so in the court system, it unfortunately means that they could lose, custody of the child. And so it's a very tangled web when you start using children in and I mean, we see this in divorces. When divorces get nasty, they try to use the kids, or they'll make snide remarks to the kids when they get divorced. But this is really not good. And I know that, because I know that sounds silly to say that, but you're harming the kids.
Yes, they have no regard for the children, okay? They are not creating a barrier so that they're not damaged for life. Because some of these children that are exposed to the domestic violence, just like my ex-wife was, again, not only did she witness the abuse, but she became abused herself. So there's double trauma. There's even consequences that some therapists see the trauma inflicted on children to deal with being witnessers of the abuse, the physical violence. And this particular woman that I mentioned, that she is married to a psychopath, is she has all her children in therapy and herself, of course, to deal with the aftermath of that.
Yeah. And it's important because, the thing is that when the children are weaponized, this becomes a wash, rinse, and repeat.
Yes.
You're instantaneously repeating the cycle of abuse, whether your child is going to be abused or the abuser. And this is something that when I talk to other groups, it's something that I always make sure to point out is sometimes the difference between being abused and abused, being the abused or the abuser, is a very thin line.
Yes.
It's a very, very thin line. So, I mean, in this one, the important thing to say is obviously responsible parenting. I mean, sharing parental responsibilities, being nonviolent role model for the children. If you're in a situation where you have an issue with your partner when it comes to the children, why I would start with law enforcement, and I would start with talking to a lawyer, because there's a lot that can happen. I would also I don't know how this works for like child protective services, because it can be tricky, but because you don't want to go to child protective services complaining about your husband and then get your children taken away from an abusive and violent home.
Understand, listeners, that when you take certain steps by law, the person you confide in has to make a report to the police. Just like if you go to a doctor's office and they see bruises and they start asking questions and they know that this is domestic violence, by law in some states, they have to report it to the police, and an investigation will be open. If you have a conversation with CPS, I don't know the particulars of that particular agency, but they also may be inclined to open an investigation, and you're at risk of having your children taken away from you.
Right.
So these are very tricky situations that you need to navigate very carefully before you actually pull the trigger on the decision that you make. And one of the things that this particular individual from the shelter said, Adele, is that the average number of incidents before a victim takes action is 7. It's like they have to go through like 7. It's like they make a decision and then they redecide. No, I'll stick it out and won't do anything. Using magical thinking that he'll change or she'll change and this will all go away. But it takes that ratcheting up of the pain and suffering before the victim actually begins to execute a plan that, again, is very carefully thought out. So just be aware, listeners, that if you're going through that self-doubt, this is part of the process leading you to eventually develop the assertiveness and the clarity to know that there's no hope. And that's where you have to be very careful.
And this is where you definitely want to take advantage of shelters and of services that will help you, because they usually have legal representation.
They do. They have attorneys that do pro bono work with the agencies. And another thing, Adele, that I failed to mention, very, very important, is sometimes here in Houston, this particular agency is going out, at least for the month of October, to putting on different events, awarenesses, to where they even have staff that is going around talking casually to victims, so that indirectly they ask questions and provide information, especially if the abuser is with them, so that they can subtly speak code or get some valuable information. Because again, these people have been trained that victims are under surveillance of their abusers, and they have to be very careful. So it's like they developed a system to very subtly, again, provide information to victims that they know they're under surveillance with their abuser.
Yeah. So if you're in a situation where you have children and it's violent, or you're in an abusive situation where your children are being used, I would highly suggest that while you're working on a plan, that you start reaching out to your local domestic violence coalition so that you can start a plan of action in order to leave, and also so that they can help direct you to whoever you might need to speak to that can give you some legal protection. Because the other thing is that when you leave, you don't want to be accused of kidnapping.
Yes, very good. Very good. That's right. Because again, the system is not set up completely, fail-proof system. The justice system is not completely set up to care for victims.
No.
The laws can be used against them if they don't follow a carefully thought out plan.
Right.
I'm going to put some links in the show note for different shelters here, listeners, in the Houston area, and maybe even some links in the Louisiana area, if you're listening to us from Louisiana, of shelters that you can reach out to, because they're an excellent resource.
Yep.
They are trained in this. They have professionals on board to really, really understand all the nuance of domestic violence.
Absolutely.
One more thing that we forgot to mention is pets that could be included in this slot.
Yep.
I heard Purina during the month of October running ads that they've actually created. They partnered up with shelters for pets for victims of domestic violence, that they will also house their pets without any cost to support victims of domestic abuse. So if you listeners have pets and you're in an abusive relationship, know that there's resources out there so that you and your pets can leave.
Absolutely.
You're listening to Courageous Healing Podcast. We'll be right back.
Looking for the perfect soundtrack to bring your project to life? Meet Roy D. Haston, an experienced composer who creates captivating music for films, commercials, and live events. From emotional scores to upbeat, energetic tracks, Roy's compositions add depth and emotion to every story. His unique soundscapes elevate your project and leave a lasting impression. Visit roydhaston.com and discover how Roy's music can transform your next project into something unforgettable. And thank you, Roy, for your original music for our Courageous Healing podcast.
So the next rung on this wheel is using, and it says on the wheel, it says using male privilege, but I'm just going to call it using privilege. And it's treating them like a servant, making all the big decisions, acting like the master of the castle, being the one to define the roles in the house. The opposite of this is shared responsibility. You know, it's mutually agreeing on fair distribution of work and making family decisions together. In this particular situation, the thing about this is that someone in the household is doing all the work, the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, and it's being demanded, and it's being expected in a way that comes with punishment.
You're a slave to the abuser.
Right. So just because you're in a relationship and your partner's pick the chores of doing the laundry and doesn't do the laundry, or, or decides to, fuss at you because the laundry isn't done, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're using privilege. In this particular instance, when you're not doing what they expect to be done in a certain way, there's violence that comes along with it. There's some sort of either emotional abuse or there's some sort of physical, there's repercussions. You're going to experience repercussions if you don't do everything that you're supposed to do.
Since I'm so intimately knowledgeable about your experience, talk about the time that you had to iron Chad's uniform and you accidentally burned it because you were ironing a synthetic material with cotton. So talk about that, because that's where my mind goes to with something like this.
So let me preface it with saying that I accidentally on purpose did it.
Oh, okay.
The thing is that I don't iron and I never have. And so it's not a skill that I've ever had to do. My ex-husband, Chad, who was in the military. So obviously he learned how to iron and starch his clothes as well as iron. He took the responsibility of ironing his uniforms because he ironed them the same way he did his uniforms for work that he did when he was in the military. He used the same techniques. So one time something had happened and he had asked me to iron a shirt for him because he needed to change his shirt. I went to iron it. I took the iron out and I went to do it. And the pockets, it was a cotton shirt, but they had those pocket flaps and the pocket flaps were polyester. And so I didn't know that needed a different temperature. And so when I ironed the pocket flaps, I burned it and melted it. I got in trouble for that one too. I got in big trouble. But thankfully he had another shirt. And his mom, he had an older shirt that he no longer wore. So he was able to take it to his mom and she switched out the pocket flap. But that type of thing. He knew that I didn't iron. So he knew even asking me to iron, he was just trying to see if I could help him a little bit. But in this particular instance, I did get in trouble because it was something that I didn't do and I burned his shirt. And so, but at the same time, I was being accused of not being a good wife. Yes. I was being accused of not being qualified to be his wife. So this was also during the time that I was planning to leave. And as listeners, as you've heard me talk about before, I used his game against him. And I manipulated my way out of the situation by agreeing that I was not good enough for him. So by doing something like this, so that's why I say it was kind of an accidentally on purpose, because by doing something like this and causing damage to something to him that was so absolutely precious, proved that I was not qualified. I was able to use it in future arguments.
Sure.
I was able to say to him, look, I can't even iron your uniform. I don't know what you're doing with me. I can't even iron your uniform.
Reverse psychology. You're right. I'm worthless. I'm not good in bed. You deserve someone better.
I don't know what you're doing with me. I don't know why we just don't get it. Yeah. That was what caused the split. It was basically at that point I had convinced him that yes, absolutely, I am not worth you. I'm not worthy of you. So with that being said, that's something that when you have your wits about you and you're in an abusive relationship and you start to plan how to get out, and, in many cases, you can kind of play this kind of game. You can use intimidation. You can use the intimidation and kind of role reversal it in some kind of way. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the situation is going to be the same, but sometimes that's where there's always a crack in the wall. There's always a crack in the wall. The biggest difference is how violent they are. It could have been a bad night for me if he would have been a violent human being. But, I was subjected, as I've said before, I was subjected to sexual abuse, not physical. I wasn't beaten or punched or hit. And we have 2 more to go, and then we're almost
more to go.
The next two are pretty obvious. This one is using economic abuse. It's preventing her from getting or keeping a job, making her ask for money, giving her an allowance, taking her money, not letting her know about or have any access to the family income. This in itself is a situation where is very dangerous because they know if you have no money, you can't leave.
Yes.
So if you're trying to leave, this is one of the things that we've given advice from frequently, is if you're trying to leave, a friend or someone that you know has to have a bag for you to be able to get away. And it has to have a burner phone, some cash, because you're not going to be able to use credit cards. And in cash for a good bit of cash, $500 to $1,000 at least, or at least get from point A to point safety. And so economic abuse is a really dangerous one because if they, like my ex-husband liked to run up the credit cards. We weren't making a whole lot of money, but our credit card bills were, $15,000, $20,000.
Wow.
And so because he just liked to spend money and credit cards were easy. And then I did have some cash savings in the bank that he spent that as well. It was not uncommon. He was while I was learning about money and I was learning about budgeting and things like that. And then as a couple, we had a joint checking account because that's what everybody did. I was watching the way that our money was being spent and not being able to pay these bills. So, for him, the economic abuse was that he just spent money freely. And had we tried to stay together, we would eventually have had to file bankruptcy because there's no way that we could have paid the bills that he was generating.
Yes. Okay.
So the obvious opposite of this one is an economic partnership, making decisions together, making sure both partners benefit from financial arrangements. I think money is one of those conversations that you actually should have very early on in a relationship. You don't necessarily have to disclose your finances to your partner, but definitely talk about and get about, how does this person spend money? Do they like to save money? Do they have a retirement account? Do they save, what is their, because it can be on the other side of this too, where in a financial abuse can mean that they don't spend any money.
I had one case, Adele. They had like $30,000 in the bank in savings. Their house was owned free and clear. Their vehicles were owned free and clear. And when she went to the grocery store and spent 5 cents on a name brand can of vegetables, as opposed to the house brand, he would throw a fit because again, he was a miser. 5 cents was because he had no respect for her. He would start a fight with her because she spent 5 cents, imagine, on a can of vegetables, okay? She was a hairdresser and she was not allowed to pay a hairdresser to do her hair. So she had to cut her own hair. She had to do everything on herself. And she had to go buy her clothes at a resale shop, even though he had a white-collar job and even though she had her own shop. When you went to their house, you had to take off your shoes at the door because he didn't want the carpet, 30-year-old green carpet, to be walked on with shoes. Imagine that.
Amazing. Yeah. And that's the other thing too, is sometimes a person is so abusive that they're actually abusive to your friends and the people that come over to the house.
Yes. One day she snapped, Adele, and she went and cleaned out the savings. Mm-hmm. She went and bought a red convertible. Mm-hmm. And she went to she spent hundreds of dollars on herself, having her hair done and makeup and what have you, and went and bought new clothes and filed for divorce. Okay. Because again, the mental abuse had been too much and had driven her to that point.
Exactly.
That's what we're talking about is mental abuse because of finance. Yep. One more to go, Adele.
The use of coercion and threats. So making in or carrying out threats to do something to hurt her, threatening to leave her, to commit suicide, to report her to welfare, to making her drop charges and making her do illegal things. There's another thing that I want to add to this, and this is a topic that you and I haven't talked about yet, which we will, but it's something that in the word coercion that made me think of this. Coercion is the act of being convinced, and the act of being convinced to do something. And in teenage abusive relationships, frequently that's how young girls or young boys end up losing their virginity. It's because their partner who coerces them into having sex or into doing something a little too soon. So it's the same thing with this as well, where they're using the coercions in order to get what they want. And in this particular situation, oh, I'm not going to hurt you again. I'm not going to do anything again. Drop the charges. Other side of that is a threat. Or if you don't fucking drop the charges, I'm going to shoot you.
Yeah. And here in Houston, and I'm sure in other parts of the country, Adele, is they hold power over you because they threaten the victim that they're going to turn them into immigration because they don't have legal status. Okay. Mm-hmm. So again, they're being trafficked, even though they may be married to them, even though they may be in a relationship, they're held hostage because of their legal status and the fear of being turned over to immigration. Now, listeners, if you are a victim and you don't have legal status in the country, you can go to a shelter and they will represent you. There is a law that you can get your residency if you're a victim of domestic violence. Doesn't matter if the abuser is a citizen, a resident, or even themselves undocumented.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. So, I mean, this one goes pretty deep because this one can come from all directions. Yeah. But just know that the use of trying to convince somebody to do something, they're really two different things. The coercion and the threats. The threats are very obvious. Threats are obviously very obvious. But when you're being convinced, that's when you are like, so that reminds me of when I first met my ex-husband and I was on the phone with him. And he would not hang up the phone until I told him I loved him.
Okay.
And I didn't hang up the phone on him, which is what I should have done. But he was like, tell me you love me. Tell me, I know you do. Tell me you love me. And I was like, but not yet. Not yet. I'm not yet. I was young. I was 17. I didn't know. He was coercing me into telling him that I loved him in an effort to sealing the fate of whatever this was the beginning of. So the opposite of that, Victor, is negotiation and fairness. It's seeking mutually satisfying resolutions to conflict, accepting change, and being willing to compromise. A healthy relationship, you might want to convince your husband to go to Disney World with you, or you might want to convince somebody to go out to dinner or go to a particular movie or to go see a Taylor Swift concert. But you're not using threats and it's not violent and it's negotiation and it's fairness for both parties.
Very good. So, well, friends, we're going to have to leave it there because Adele and I have to hop on another phone call. But any final words, Adele?
Guys, we're looking for people who want to come on and sit down and talk with us. We want to talk about your courageous healing. We want to talk about what you've done to heal yourself. So please reach out to us. We're more than happy. We'd love to interview you.
And thank you for following us and listening to the show. Until next time, go out and have a great week.
See you later.